Hello, my name is Jonas, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you the LightMix feature for the upcoming Vray 5. I'm also going to show you some issues that I ran into and how I managed to solve those issues. Okay, so this is the scene that we're going to be using. Let me just tell from the beginning, I'm using the Vray 5 beta and in particular version 2, which is the latest release at the moment. But of course stuff is still in development, so everything that you see here might still change in the final version or in the final release of Vray. Something about the scene now, it is a quite simple scene. So you can see I have a ground plane here. I have a shading dummy model here in the center. We have these two spheres which have very simple materials applied to them to evaluate our shading. And I have this ring object here that uses Vray light self-illumination material. Then about the lighting in our scene. So as you can see, it's a pretty straightforward setup. I have a couple of Vray lights positioned around the shading dummies, hitting it from all different kind of directions. And I have this dome light, or in this instance, I have two dome lights. One is responsible for the diffuse contribution, and one is responsible for the HDRI reflections. Okay, if we render this, we get a result that looks like this. So you can see this one is a new Vray Framebuffer. I have here my source, which is at the moment set to RGB. Then I'm using a denoiser on top, and I'm using the NVIDIA AI denoiser for fast response times. I have this lens effect applied to it for this post-glow effect. And then there's three simple adjustments put on top: one exposure adjustment, one lookup table, and one curves adjustment, right? And then we get basically this kind of result. So now what we can see here, if we go back to our source, at the moment it's set to RGB. And now there's this new feature here, actually these two new features. For today, we're only gonna focus on this one, LightMix. So if I now try to enable this feature, I will get like a black screen and it says, please add LightMix render element and re-render. So that's exactly what we're gonna do now. So let me take over my render layers or render elements, press this add button here and choose this LightMix render element. And there's a bunch of options that we can choose down here, but for now we just leave everything by default. Okay, so let's switch this one back to RGB. And now there's two choices: either we can do a full render or we can also do an interactive render. So that's exactly what I'm gonna start now, start the interactive rendering. So after the scene is starting to be translated, it's preparing the lights. And then we need to wait a moment, and as soon as the denoiser kicks in, we will have an image that looks pretty much exactly the same like I showed you before. So that's this stage now. Okay, and now if we switch to this LightMix layer, we can see we get a result that looks exactly like this one. And that's basically how it should be. So both of those should look by default exactly the same. If they don't look the same, and I ran into a couple of issues before where they don't look the same, then first you need to evaluate what is the problem that prevents them from looking exactly the same, right? But this, I will later show you like two examples which I found out so far where both of them don't look the same, and then I'll show you how I could solve those issues. But there might be more problems that so far I didn't really find out. So yeah, we will see about this later, right? So now we're here on this LightMix, and we can see all of those layers now that are present here, right? So there's like all of these ones, all the ones that are starting with LGT. Those are all the lights which I have in my scene. So I named them like this, right? Every light in my scene has like this LGT pre-tag. So those are all of those ones here. And then there's these three other elements. So one is all, one is environment, and one is self-illumination, right? Yeah, so basically I can, for example, start by switching off everything, right? So everything is completely black. And then I can start to introduce all of the different elements of my scenes, and I can start to rearrange them, or I can start to modify them individually, and this all in a pretty fast, immediate way, basically, right? So I can, for example, show my top light, I can show my front light, I can show my strong backlight, I can unhide those three shaper lights here, for example. I can show or can add this environment diffuse light, and I can show, if you now look at the sphere down here with the chrome shader applied to it, if I now show this this other environment like with the HDRI inside, then basically I can now start to see my environment reflections, right? And then I have those other two layers, which V-Ray added by itself, right? So one is called environment, and one is called self-illumination, right? So self-illumination, as you can see, it basically contains all the parts of the scene that are using self-illumination materials, right? So if I go to my material editor, for example, this one is a material that I have applied for this ring. So it's a V-Ray light material. Or if you have a V-Ray material, which is using this self-illumination here, then this would also be contained in this layer, right? And the other, in the self-illumination layer. And then the other part, the other layer is this environment layer, right? So this layer is also special because it contains everything that I have set up here in my environment, right? So at the moment you can see that I'm only using a black background color because this map here is disabled. So it's containing everything that's in this tab here, and also everything that's set up in this tab, right? So at the moment I have a GI environment put in here, and if I would have an HDI environment or a refractive environment, everything that's basically part of this environment tab would be added in this environment tab here together, right? So for now, for example, I can just boost up the GI if I choose this layer, right? Because at the moment it only contains the GI in my instance, right? Yeah. So then what you saw also here, basically all of those, each of the layer here has two bars here on the right side. One stands for intensity and one stands for the color, right? So let's, for example, switch off a couple of stuff so that we can see stuff better or more clear. So for example, I take this backlight and I can boost up the intensity, or I can lower the intensity, or I can bring it back to how it was before, to default. And I can even choose different colors, right? So for example, I can choose a green color, I can choose a purple color, I can choose this orange color here, right? And you can see the changes are happening pretty much instant, right? So that's really cool from my perspective. Yeah, we can start to do crazy stuff, like for example, having some bluish color here, and then some greenish color here. You can really see how fast you can change basically all lighting elements in your scene and totally define totally new looks and new kind of moods for your scene, right? And if you went too crazy, you can, for example, just reset everything how it was before. So now you can see the RGB looks like this, and our light mix looks like this, right? So they look pretty much different. So if I now want to make it look the same like in the RGB, I can just reset it and everything is going to be zeroed out and brought back to the default values. Okay, and what is really cool in particular is that even for your shaders in the scene, right, for everything that's here in the self-illumination layer, you can basically adjust the color tones, right? So you can make it a red color, you can make it like this greenish color. And let me just check why the lens effects. Okay, now the lens effects should update. Let me just restart this here again. Because the rendering already finished, so it wasn't updating it anymore, but now it should go back to updating it again. Yeah, right. So yeah, so I can choose different kind of colors inside here. This very yellow color, this slightly bluish color, and so on, right? And I can even, so let me just take this back to default. I can even change the intensities, right? So I can boost the intensity very strong. I can make it a very low intensity, like half intensity, for example, or I can just bring it back to how it was before. And even if you remember this one, environment reflect light, this one is a dome light with a HDRI pipe inside. I can even like make my HDI brighter, for example, or I can even tint everything that I have in my in this light, right? So I can make it like all kind of different color tints, without having to go back to the light or the HDI and having to adjust the color tones there, right? So you really have like a huge amount of flexibility that you can do. And what I even noticed here is that in this self-illumination, as you can see down here, for example, we have in the sphere reflecting this self-illumination part. So even if I switch off my self-illumination layer, not only is it updating it here, right? Or if I change different colors here, as you can see, it's even updating it down here, right? So it's not only affecting the primary rays, it's basically also it's influencing all parts of the scene where this self-illumination would be present, right? So I mean, from my perspective, this is a pretty neat feature. Okay, so what else can we do? Basically, for example, we let's make a lighting mood again. For example, this one here, where we have this very orange backlight color, and then we really like this mood, for example. Then we can save a preset here, and let's just go, for example, to desktop. Put it inside here. Let's call it Moody Light Mix. And now this preset is saved. And before I saved another preset that I did earlier, and you can, for example, load another preset that I did before. So before I made this one and I called it Disco. And then he remembers the preset that you loaded. And basically you can then switch between the different presets here in a really fast way. You just hover over the mouse. And if you have like 10 different presets, for example, saved out, you can very fast check all of the presets and then see which ones you like the most. Okay, so then let's just reset everything. And now one very important thing that you need to understand is that all of those adjustments here basically are post effects. That means Vray is doing all the calculations based on this file here, right? Based on how your scene is really set up. And then basically everything that's being changed in this light mix here is basically just changes that are done after it evaluates the real lighting information in your scene. The real lighting information is the information that you really set up in your lights here, basically, right? So for example, it's easy to demonstrate that if we have this this one here is our backlight. At the moment, it's using a pure white color, but let's see what happens if I change this to pure red. So now it uses like 255 in the red channel. Takes a moment to update. Let's check here the RGB layer first, right? So we can see our red backlight now. Now if we change to the light mix, then this one is also updated. And now what I want to show you is that basically, so we have this backlight here. So now because this light is using a very, very strong color already, if we now start to change it here, right? So let's say I want to choose a blue color, I want to choose a green color, I want to choose a pink color, right? Anything that I do here, it's not really affecting the color at all, right? And why is that? Because our value here is already extremely red, and basically the end result that you will get is like a combination of those two colors that you set up in here, right? So if this light already uses a very, very strong color here, then the result that you will get in your light mix is not exactly what you would expect, right? So you need to know that if you set up a scene basically and you plan to do all your lighting in the light mix, right? Then the most important thing is that in your 3ds Max scene, all the lights should ideally be set to pure white, right? So that those color adjustments here, they would also be applied in the correct way, right? So now the light is set to white, it will take a moment to update. And now if I go in here in my backlight, I can freely change the light color again, right? So that's just very important to know and to understand. Okay, the same is basically true for sampling, right? So that if in case you have a scene with the lighting set up like this, and then you change, you would make some really drastic changes, right? So for example, I make this one very, very bright, and let's just give it back a color of white, right? Basically, all the sampling that's applied to the scene is basically based on this file, right? So if you make a final rendering, all your samplings, all your anti-aliasing basically will follow this file. And everything that's set up in the LightMix is basically just adjustments that are made to your original information that you have in your RGB layer here, right? So that's also important to know, is that in the LightMix, I mean, there's certain kind of boundaries that you can tweak, but if you make some really drastic changes, then you might encounter some issues in the sampling area, and stuff maybe doesn't really expect exactly the same way like you were expecting, right? So I mean, the denoiser, for example, he cleans out a lot of stuff, right? But for example, some parts in this file here would be much more noisy than you might expect, right? And you would need to increase the sampling a lot in order to clean up those parts, basically. So this is probably where this button here will come to play. It's called 𝐘𝐨𝐮. At the moment, it doesn't work yet. So I assume it's going to be a feature that will come up in the next versions, hopefully, which will then transfer all of the settings and all of the color adjustments that you did here. It will transfer it back to your original light in the scene, right? So for example, if I have here a multiplier set to 4, right? If I then would press this button, he would go back to the light here in my backlight, and he will just multiply this value here with whatever value I set up in here, right? So it would multiply this value by 4, it would set it to 400, and it will change the color to whatever color I basically set up in here. At the moment, it doesn't work yet, as said, but that's the meaning of this button, as far as I assume. Okay, so then let's reset everything back to default. And now I want to show you some instances that I ran into where the LightMix doesn't work, or doesn't work the way like you would expect it to, right? So like what I said earlier before, you have to make sure that both those layers, if all of those settings here are reset, both of them, they should exactly the same. Should look like exactly the same. And if they are not, then there's a problem in the scene, right? So for example, I found one very easy issue, which is this one here. If I go to my GI tab and I change my primary GI engine, for example, to irradiance map, and I go back to the RGB layer, and let's just choose here like a low preset to speed it up. So let's start a new rendering, and it might take a while until the stuff is translated. Light cache. Then now he's calculating the GI irradiance map, and basically once that's done, my image looks exactly like before, right, in the RGB parse. But what happens now if I go to my LightMix parse is that for whatever reason, everything that's piped into the self-elimination part here doesn't show up, right? So this part here is now completely doesn't have any value, or doesn't have any information inside at all, right? So problem is easily fixed. We just switch back this one here to brute force, and then it works again. I don't know if this will be changed in the future, but it's just something that I ran into. Okay, let me stop this. And then let's just switch this one back here to brute force. Get this out of the way. Another issue that I found is, for example, in the scene, I have two kind of ground planes. Let me hide the lights. So that's the ground plane that I'm using now. It's a very standard geometry. I also have this floor mat in my scene, right, which looks pretty much the same in the viewport, but the only difference is that it's a matte object, right? And if I render then, basically I have my, if I go to my environment tab, once that opens, it's here. So I have this background map here, which looks exactly like this. So I'm just using a background that looks exactly the same way like my normal rendered background, and it's just there to speed up my rendering, right? Because he doesn't have to calculate. Calculate the calculation for the floor. So that's the initial setup that I was using. And if I render this now, and let's switch back here to RGB, then we can see, okay, RGB looks fine again, right? But now if I go to my LightMix, then once the denoiser updates. Now it's the wrong one, yeah, so now it's updated. So then you can see the environment totally disappears, right? So that's another issue that I went in, that I discovered, is that if you're using matte objects, maybe the result that you get in the LightMix is not exactly the same like what you expect in the, like what you would expect it to look like, right? So in my case, that was an easy fix. I could just replace the ground plane with the original ground plane, and then everything looked back to how it was before. But in your case, the solution might not be so simple, and it's always an individual solution for the problem that you're facing. Okay, so in this case, I basically just unhide my original floor again, and I would change in the environment. I would just change the map, the environment color back to black. Once that opens, which always takes a long time. Yeah, it was. Okay, change the environment color back to black, and then everything works and behaves the correct way again. Okay, so that's pretty much my first overview about the new V-Ray LightMix feature. I hope you liked this tutorial. I hope you got something out of it. And in case you like this kind of content, in case you like these kind of tutorial videos, I'm happy to produce more. Just somehow let me know that you like them. Give them a like on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, anything like this that I know people like this kind of content, then I would be very happy to produce more. All right, thank you very much and take care.